When I saw my husband reading the folded piece of paper he had just picked up from the kitchen floor, my entire body froze, not out of guilt, but from the terrifying certainty that it was the one I forgot to throw away. I stood in the hallway, half hidden behind the open door, watching as his eyes skimmed the page. His brow furrowed, his mouth slightly opened. I knew the words by heart. I knew what they meant. I knew what they could destroy. He read in silence, but each second felt like thunder crashing in my chest. I wanted to run forward, snatch it from his hands, say it was a joke, something old, something meaningless. But my feet wouldn't move. My fingers clutched the edge of the wall until the pain grounded me. He turned the paper over, saw the handwriting on the back. His shoulders dropped slightly. The kind of drop that comes when you see confirmation of what you feared, or maybe hoped not to be true. He looked toward the doorway. Not directly at me. Not yet. But he knew I was there. My mind raced. I thought of how it started. How innocent it seemed. How little by little everything changed. I thought of the garden, the coffee mugs, the music in the background. I thought of the towel in my hand the day he walked in. And then I thought of the night my husband had left for just one evening, and I stayed behind. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. My breath shook. He still hadn't said a word. The silence was unbearable. And yet in that silence, I heard everything. The accusation. The heartbreak. The ending. 3 weeks ago, I made a choice, a mistake, that rewrote every corner of my life. And now, I need to tell you what really happened. But before I share the secret I've been hiding so carefully, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? And have you ever had a secret you tried to bury, only to watch it rise to the surface when you least expected it? The first thing I noticed was his voice. Not the pitch, not even the words, but the way they lingered just a second longer after he spoke. As if they didn't want to leave the air. That's how I knew I was in trouble, though I didn't understand it at the time. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, the car pulling up just as I was rinsing lettuce in the sink. I didn't recognize the sound of the tires on gravel. It wasn't my husband's car. I wiped my hands on the dish towel and stepped outside, the screen door creaking open behind me. He smiled. That same boyish smile I remembered from years ago, only now framed by a leaner face, shoulders broader, movements slower, more deliberate. My husband waved from the driver's seat. He's staying for a bit, he called out. I told you, remember? I didn't. Or maybe I had forgotten. Or maybe I just wasn't listening the night he mentioned it. Another background detail in a life already heavy with repetition. We showed him the guest room. Simple, clean. The bedspread freshly washed just yesterday. I had ironed the pillowcases out of habit, not knowing who they were for. I remember feeling vaguely embarrassed by how much effort I'd put into something I thought would go unnoticed. That evening, the three of us sat down to dinner, grilled chicken, rice, a salad I dressed with too much vinegar. They talked mostly about work, university, travel. I watched the way his eyes shifted between us, measuring the tempo of our marriage. He wasn't nosy, just observant. I could see that. He listened the way people listen when they're still curious about the world. After dinner, I gathered the plates. My husband went into his office, emails, deadlines, something about an investor call. Our nephew stood beside me in the kitchen without being asked. Want help, he said, already rolling up his sleeves. No one ever offers, I laughed, reaching for the sponge. I'm not no one, he replied, and the words hit the air too sharply, too cleanly. I didn't know what to say to that. I handed him a towel instead. He dried. I rinsed. The radio played something soft and familiar, an old tune I couldn't quite place. He asked about my garden. I told him about the roses that refused to bloom this year. We didn't talk about anything important. And yet, when the last dish was put away, I felt like something had just started, even if I couldn't name it yet. Later that night, I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to him breathe in that steady rhythm I'd grown used to over the years. Comforting, dependable. And yet, distant. Like a lighthouse on the horizon you can see but never quite reach. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found myself opening the curtains wider than usual, letting in more light. I changed the sheets even though they were clean. I put on a different sweater. One with a slightly lower neckline. Nothing dramatic, just something softer. Something I hadn't worn in a while. Over breakfast, our nephew complimented the jam I'd made. My husband barely noticed the new spread I'd laid out, fresh fruit, muffins, the good coffee. He scrolled through his tablet. Deadlines. News. The noise of his routine. After he left the table, our guest stayed behind. We talked about books. He liked the same author I loved in my 20s. I told him I'd grown out of those stories. You never really outgrow what first moved you, he said. I didn't know how to respond. But I remembered the line. In the afternoon, I went to the garden. I pruned roses that didn't need pruning. He passed by, offering to fix the broken latch on the side gate. I told him where the tools were. He thanked me. Nothing in his tone was flirtatious, and yet every exchange felt heavy, as though we were rehearsing something neither of us had planned to perform. When my husband came home, I didn't mention the garden, the latch, or the coffee he didn't notice. I asked about his call. He nodded, distracted, already half out of the conversation. That evening, I watched our guest from the kitchen window. He was out back, stretching after a run, hands behind his head, shirt damp from sweat. There was nothing inappropriate about it, nothing intentional. But I watched too long. Long enough to feel something stir deep inside me. Something I hadn't felt in years. I chastised myself. Told myself it was just curiosity. Just noticing. Just the strangeness of someone new in a house where nothing ever changed. That night, I fell asleep facing away from my husband, a wall of silence between our backs. In the dark, I let myself wonder, how many small things does it take to create something irreversible? Apparently, not many. Not many at all. The next morning started with the distant hum of the washing machine, the kind of sound that usually blended into the background of my daily routines. But today, it rang louder, more deliberate, as if trying to pull my attention somewhere I didn't want it to go. I was in the laundry room, bent over the basket, sorting towels, the smell of detergent heavy in the air. The sunlight came in through the small window above the sink, casting warm patches on the floor tiles. I liked that moment, the quiet, the order, the domestic simplicity of it. It was the kind of solitude I'd grown used to, a corner of the house that was mine. I was in the middle of folding a damp sheet when I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't expect anyone. My husband had gone into his office half an hour earlier. I turned my head slightly, and there he was, our guest, standing in the doorway, his hands still on the handle, eyes widening with a flicker of embarrassment. "Oh, I didn't know you were in here," he said quickly, taking a half step back. I stood upright, brushing my hands on the sides of my shorts. My tank top clung slightly to my back, damp from the steam and heat of the machines. For a second, we both stood frozen, as though unsure of the next move. I gave him a small smile, trying to make the moment disappear. "It's all right," I said. "Just finishing up." He nodded, glanced at the pile of clothes, and then at the window. "The sky's clearing up," he added, seemingly grasping for something to say. "Good," I replied. "Maybe the garden won't drown today." He laughed, just briefly, before slipping away with a muttered apology. I stayed still for a moment longer, staring at the door after it closed. My heart was racing in a way I couldn't explain, and I hated myself for the way my skin felt warm where his eyes had landed. I folded the rest of the laundry more quickly than usual, as though hurrying through a thought I didn't want to finish. My hands were shaking slightly when I reached for the basket, and I told myself it was just the humidity. Later that afternoon, my husband had gone for a long walk with a neighbor, something they did every few days, mostly to talk about stocks or the decline of real news. It used to annoy me, his ability to slip into comfortable conversation with others while becoming more silent with me, but now I welcomed the space. I made tea and carried it to the veranda. The breeze had picked up, brushing the sheer curtain like fingers along a piano. I sat down with my book, though I didn't open it. Instead, I watched the trees shift and listened to the occasional distant bark of a dog. He came out quietly, a guitar case in his hand. I hadn't known he played. He settled on the edge of the wooden railing, opened the case, and began tuning. His movements were careful, like someone used to solitude, someone who respected quiet. "Didn't know you played," I said after a moment. He looked up, smiled faintly. "A little. Helps me think." "What do you play?" He shrugged. "Old things. Things that don't get played anymore." "Play something," I said, surprising even myself. He did. The first notes were soft, hesitant, but they settled into something steady. It was a song I hadn't heard in years, a melody from a time when I still believed change was always for the better. It washed over me, not with nostalgia, but with a kind of mourning. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just let it carry me. When the song ended, we sat in silence. He put the guitar down carefully, as if laying something fragile to rest. "It's beautiful," I finally said. "Thank you." We didn't look at each other immediately, and maybe that's what made it feel so heavy. The absence of eye contact. The presence of everything else. Eventually, I turned to him. He was already watching me. There was no smile. Just an expression I didn't know how to read. A question, maybe. Or a waiting. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I didn't even breathe. We kissed. It was brief. Quiet. No more than a breath between two people. But it was enough to unmake me. When I pulled back, I stood abruptly. My hands trembled, though I tucked them behind my back. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. I walked into the house, each step heavier than the last. In the kitchen, I washed my hands even though they were clean. I stared into the sink as the water rushed over my skin, my reflection faint in the metal basin. I told myself it meant nothing. That it was a moment, a mistake, a confusion. But deep down, I knew what had just happened would not disappear. That night, I couldn't meet my husband's eyes. He didn't notice. He talked about the neighbor's new car and some podcast he'd started. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, and poured wine I didn't want. Later, lying in bed, I faced the window instead of him. I counted the minutes between his breaths. I tried to recall the sound of the guitar and wished I hadn't asked him to play it. But it wasn't the music that undid me. It was the way he looked at me when the strings went still. And now, no matter how many words I whispered to myself in the dark, I couldn't take that look back. The following morning, I opened the curtains wider than usual, letting sunlight flood the room in a way that almost felt deliberate, like I was trying to cleanse something. I stood there for a moment, hands gripping the windowsill, watching the dust particles dance in the golden light. They moved freely, untouched, unlike me rooted in a house that no longer felt familiar. I went through the motions of breakfast. Toast. Coffee. The gentle clink of plates. My husband, seated at the head of the table, brows furrowed as he scrolled through news on his tablet. The usual routine. If something had shifted in me the night before, it hadn't reached him. Or maybe it had, and he was choosing not to see it. Our guest entered the room quietly, as he always did, his hair still damp from the shower, shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He greeted us both, his tone polite but distant. I couldn't meet his eyes. Not properly. Not yet. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me. I felt the air between us tighten, as though charged. My fingers trembled slightly as I passed him the sugar bowl. Our hands didn't touch, but I felt the proximity like a static charge. I focused hard on my plate, willing my thoughts into the buttered toast. When I glanced up, he was watching me, not intensely, but with something that made my chest tighten. There was no accusation in his gaze, just a quiet knowing. We said nothing. Not then. My husband excused himself for a work call and disappeared into his office. The silence he left behind echoed louder than any conversation. I stood, gathering the dishes quickly, almost too quickly, my movements betraying my unrest. He rose too, without a word, and followed me into the kitchen. For a moment we were alone again, the air between us thick with what had not been said. I busied myself with the sink, turning the water on high, letting the steam rise. "Are you okay?" he asked softly behind me. I didn't turn around. I nodded, staring at the water cascading over my hands. "Fine," I said, though the word landed hollow. The screen door creaked open then, and I heard the neighbor calling out, a cheerful greeting, asking if I had a minute. I welcomed the interruption like a lifeline, grabbing the dish towel and stepping outside, the sun nearly blinding. She was her usual self, brisk, talkative, arms full of herbs from her garden. She handed me a bundle of rosemary and thyme, saying she thought I might like it for cooking. I thanked her, offered her a glass of lemonade. She declined but lingered anyway, her eyes flicking toward the house behind me. "He's a handsome one, your nephew," she said casually, eyes narrowing with a glint of amusement. I felt my throat tighten. "Yes, well, he's my husband's nephew." "Still," she continued, smiling, "you're lucky to have something young in the house. Breaks up the monotony." I managed a tight smile. She meant nothing by it. Probably. But my stomach twisted all the same. After she left, I stood in the garden for a long while, herbs wilting in my hand, thoughts churning. The breeze carried the scent of earth and grass, grounding and familiar. But nothing felt steady anymore. Not inside me. By midday, I had managed to avoid both of them, my husband engrossed in work calls, and our guest having retreated to his room. I stayed in the kitchen, sorting drawers I had ignored for years, wiping surfaces that were already clean. I needed movement. Distraction. Anything to fill the spaces my thoughts wanted to inhabit. I found an old photo in one of the drawers thus, on a beach vacation, smiling into the sun. My husband had his arm around my waist. My head rested on his shoulder. We looked like a couple in rhythm. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember how that version of us felt. I couldn't. Or maybe I didn't want to. Later that evening, I made dinner without asking for help. I needed the solitude of chopping, stirring, seasoning, mundane actions that asked nothing of me emotionally. My husband appeared just before we sat down, glancing over the meal with a distracted nod. He complimented the food, but I didn't hear the words, only the habit in his tone. Our guest was quiet throughout dinner. He asked a few questions about my husband's work, nodded at the answers, then fell silent again. I couldn't tell if he was giving me space or drawing boundaries for himself. Either way, it unsettled me. After dinner, I stepped outside alone. The evening air was cool, touched with the scent of coming rain. I walked barefoot across the porch, wrapping my cardigan tighter around me. My mind replayed every moment of the day, the glances, the words, the silence. The photo. The neighbor's comment. I felt watched. Not by anyone in particular, but by the weight of my own conscience. I sat on the steps, hands tucked under my knees, trying to slow my thoughts. Trying to believe that yesterday had been a moment, not a beginning. Eventually, I returned inside, past the guest room without stopping. I went to bed early, pretending exhaustion. My husband didn't join me right away. I lay in the dark, eyes open, heart restless. When he finally came in, he moved quietly, undressing in the dim light, slipping under the covers with a sigh. He turned his back to me without a word, as he had done so many nights before. This time, I didn't mind. I welcomed the silence. The distance. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I realized something that made my stomach lurch. He didn't suspect anything. Not yet. And that terrified me more than if he had. Because it meant I was alone in this. Alone with what had happened. Alone with what might happen again. And worse, it meant that part of me, buried beneath layers of doubt and fear, wanted it to. The sky was already clouding over by the time I stepped outside with the shopping list in my hand. It was the kind of dull gray morning that seemed to flatten everything, the air, the trees, even the sound of birds. My husband was standing by the front door, checking his phone and muttering something about the delivery not arriving on time. He looked up when I approached. "Would you mind running to the store?" he asked, holding out the list. "Just a few things. I've got back-to-back calls all morning." I hesitated, not because I didn't want to go, but because the idea of being alone in the car with our guest struck something raw in me. He'd already asked earlier if we needed anything from town. My husband didn't seem to notice the pause. Or maybe he did, and chose to ignore it. Before I could answer, our guest appeared behind me, car keys already in his hand. "I'll drive," he said casually. "You can take a break from the wheel for once." I nodded without speaking, taking the folded list. I didn't look at my husband as I walked past him. The car ride started quietly. The hum of the engine and the occasional swipe of the windshield wipers were the only sounds for a while. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, though I wasn't the one driving. My fingers clenched the list in my lap harder than necessary, crumpling it slightly. He adjusted the music volume, letting something soft and acoustic fill the space. I didn't recognize the song, but it had a familiar quality, simple chords, gentle melody. He tapped the steering wheel in rhythm, relaxed, composed. I envied that ease. Halfway to the store, he broke the silence. "You've been quiet lately." I kept my gaze forward. "Have I?" He didn't press. Just nodded slightly and kept driving. The road curved gently through the trees, the leaves above still clinging to their early autumn green. Everything looked like it was waiting to change. At the store, we moved through the aisles like old friends, without needing to say much. He reached for items before I asked. Remembered the brand of coffee I liked. Picked up the same bread I always chose. It was subtle, but I noticed. At the checkout, we stood side by side, a comfortable silence between us. As the cashier scanned our items, he leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "I never liked these places, too many choices." I smiled, despite myself. "That's because you're young. You still think life should be simple." He looked at me for a long second, and then replied, quietly, "I don't think that anymore." On the drive back, the rain started. Not a downpour, just a soft drizzle that made the windows blur and the world outside feel more distant. We didn't speak. But the silence was full of what had happened, of what hadn't, and of the thick uncertainty that filled every glance. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine but didn't move. I reached for the door handle. "I'm not trying to make this complicated," he said suddenly. I froze. He continued, "Whatever this is. I'm not trying to ruin anything. I just feel something I wasn't expecting." I turned to him, my fingers still on the handle. I wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came out. My throat was tight, my mind racing. I opened the door and stepped out, the cold air hitting my skin like a jolt. I didn't look back. Inside the house, the warmth felt overwhelming. I took off my jacket, set down the bags, and went straight to the kitchen. My husband was still on a call in his office. I could hear his voice through the closed door, steady and firm. He sounded exactly like himself. I unpacked the groceries slowly, giving each item more attention than it needed. My hands moved on autopilot while my thoughts swirled. Later, while putting away the last few things, I found myself staring at the jar of jam. It was the same one I had once said I liked only in passing, months ago. He had remembered. I traced the label with my finger, then put it on the top shelf, hidden behind the others. That evening, we ate dinner like nothing had shifted. My husband spoke about his day, about a frustrating client, about needing to reschedule a meeting. I nodded, responded when necessary, smiled when expected. Our guest kept his head down, eating quietly, occasionally asking a question about the project my husband was working on. After the meal, my husband went to call his brother. I stayed in the kitchen, washing the dishes one by one, though I could have finished in half the time. I watched the soap bubbles rise and burst, the way the water swirled down the drain. He came in silently, picked up a towel, and began drying. We didn't speak. Our hands moved in rhythm, passing plates, cups, cutlery. At one point, our fingers brushed. Neither of us pulled away. I finished the last dish and turned off the tap. He handed me the final dry plate. I took it slowly, our fingers barely separating. I placed it in the cupboard and stood there, my back to him. I felt him hesitate behind me, then step back. The soft sound of the towel being folded. The retreat of footsteps. The click of the guest room door. I stood in that kitchen long after he was gone, the silence thick, my pulse heavy in my ears. There was nothing dramatic in the day. No declarations. No betrayal spelled out in action. But everything had changed. I could feel it in my bones. I went upstairs, changed into my nightclothes, brushed my teeth, turned down the bed. My husband came in later, talking about his brother's upcoming trip. I smiled, nodded, slipped under the covers. He kissed my shoulder lightly before turning away to sleep. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I still belonged to the life I'd built. That one small moment, one sentence in a car, one jar of jam, one brush of fingers, could be insignificant. But I knew better. I was already drifting. And I had no idea where I would land. The air felt heavier the next morning, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I moved through the kitchen slowly, setting plates on the table with the quiet care of someone trying not to disturb whatever delicate balance remained. The light coming through the windows was pale, filtered by an overcast sky that promised rain but never delivered. My husband sat at the table, spooning cereal into his bowl like any other morning, commenting absently on something he'd read. His voice felt far away, even though he was just across from me. I nodded when I should, smiled faintly, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I was aware of every sound. The clink of his spoon. The soft hum of the refrigerator. The creak of the floorboards above us, footsteps moving in the guest room. He was awake. Our guest. I heard the water start in the upstairs bathroom, the pipes groaning slightly, a familiar sound in an old house like ours. I kept my gaze on my coffee, stirring it even though I took it black. When my husband finished breakfast, he announced he needed to visit his brother, who lived about an hour away. They were sorting through old tools in the garage, something about a broken lawnmower. He asked if I wanted to come along. I said I had a headache. It was the same excuse I used when I didn't want to go to Sunday lunches with his extended family. Predictable. Undramatic. Safe. He nodded without questioning, kissed my forehead, and told me not to wait up in case he stayed late. I walked him to the door, watched as he backed out of the driveway, and stood on the porch until the car disappeared around the bend. When I turned to go back inside, I almost collided with our guest in the hallway. He had just come downstairs, barefoot, hair damp, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. He froze when he saw me, as if unsure whether to say something or step aside. I stepped past him without speaking, but not without awareness. I could feel the space between us contract like a drawn breath. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, needing the ritual. Something to focus on. Something with steps. He walked in a moment later and leaned against the counter. "He's gone for the day?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. When the water boiled, I poured 2 cups without asking if he wanted one. I handed it to him, our fingers brushing again, accidentally, and yet not. He thanked me. His voice was quiet, but steady. We sat in the living room, the distance between us wide, each of us holding our cups like anchors. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. A soft breeze moved the curtain beside the window, lifting it gently before letting it fall again. "I'm leaving next week," he said finally. I looked up. My stomach sank, though I didn't show it. "I got a spot in the university dorms," he continued. "It's not much, but it'll do." I nodded again, unsure what to say. The idea of him leaving should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like a door quietly closing behind me. There was a long pause. The kind that builds pressure rather than easing it. "You've been kind," he said. "More than I expected." I laughed once, under my breath. "I've been conflicted." He looked at me then, really looked, and there was no curiosity in his eyes anymore. Only understanding. And something more dangerous than desire, recognition. "We kissed," he said plainly. Not as a question. Not with regret. Just as fact. I swallowed hard. The words hung in the air like steam from our cups. "I haven't been myself," I said. It was the only sentence I could manage. "You have," he replied. Maybe for the first time in a while. That hurt more than I thought it would. We sat for a long time after that, not touching, not speaking, just occupying the same room with the weight of everything between us. Eventually, he rose and said he'd go out for a walk. I nodded, watching him slip on his shoes, grab a jacket, and disappear down the path toward the woods. I didn't follow him with my eyes. I stared at the curtain again, watching it lift and fall like breath. The house felt even quieter once he was gone. I wandered aimlessly, straightening cushions that didn't need fixing, folding a blanket, wiping the already clean kitchen counter. My body needed something to do. My mind was running ahead without permission. By mid-afternoon, the weather shifted. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet leaves. I heard the first drops of rain before I saw them, soft, tentative. I went to close the windows upstairs and stopped outside his room. The door was ajar. I stood there for a moment, uncertain, and then pushed it open fully. It was neat, almost too neat. His suitcase still sat in the corner, half open. A few books stacked neatly on the desk. A jacket draped over the chair. I didn't enter. I didn't touch anything. I just looked. Back downstairs, I reheated some soup from the day before and left it on the stove, just in case someone got hungry. I didn't eat. I wasn't sure I could. He came back a little after 5. His hair was damp again, his jacket speckled with rain. He said he needed a shower. I nodded. I didn't ask where he'd gone or what he'd thought about. Later, we passed each other in the hallway again, this time without speaking. Just a glance. Just enough. At dinner, I told my husband on the phone that everything was fine. That I felt better. That the rain had been steady but not heavy. He said he might stay the night, depending on how things went. After we hung up, I stood at the sink and looked out into the dark garden. The rosemary the neighbor had given me was planted now, small and uncertain in its new spot. The soil around it was dark and wet. I wondered if it would survive the season. Behind me, the quiet steps of someone entering the kitchen. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. He stood beside me, close but not too close. Neither of us spoke. I exhaled slowly, watching the condensation form on the glass before me. There was nothing more to say. We were already standing in the middle of something that had gone too far, even if nothing had happened again. Not yet. But I could feel it. Like the first tremor before the earth shifts. The morning arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the entire house had chosen not to breathe. I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had risen, the ceiling above me just a faint blur in the dim light. My husband's side of the bed was still empty. He had stayed at his brother's place overnight as expected, but even in his absence, I felt him there. Or rather, I felt the space where he should have been. I moved quietly through the hallway, every footstep careful, as though the house might betray me if I walked too hard. In the kitchen, I brewed a pot of coffee and poured myself a cup, even though I didn't want it. The mug warmed my hands, and that was enough. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy with moisture. The sky was the same dull gray it had been all week, pressing down on the trees and flattening their color. The yard looked saturated and tired. I opened the back door and stood for a while under the overhang, letting the damp air touch my face. He appeared not long after. I heard the creak of the stairs, the soft sound of his bare feet on the floorboards, the brief pause before he entered the kitchen. I didn't turn. I continued to stare into the yard, holding the mug close to my chest like a shield. "Morning," he said softly. I nodded without facing him. "Coffee's fresh," I replied, my voice barely louder than the wind. He poured himself a cup, and we stood in silence, separated only by a few feet and everything we weren't saying. I didn't know if I was waiting for him to speak or dreading that he would. "Eventually," he said, "I've been thinking about leaving earlier." That caught my attention. I turned slightly, enough to see him leaning against the counter, the steam from his mug rising between us. "Why?" I asked, though I already knew. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down into his cup, then out the window. "It's not right for me to stay here any longer." The words landed like stones in my stomach. Heavy, expected, and yet still painful. I nodded once. "Maybe you're right." He didn't press. He didn't look at me. And maybe that was a kindness. The rest of the morning passed in fragmented tasks, laundry, sorting mail, wiping countertops that didn't need wiping. I couldn't focus. My mind was splintered, tugged between guilt and want, between what had already happened and what had almost happened again. When my husband returned around noon, the energy in the house shifted. He brought with him the smell of motor oil and old leather, his voice filling the kitchen with a kind of normalcy I hadn't felt in days. He kissed my cheek and asked how I was feeling. I told him the headache had passed. He didn't notice the way I flinched when he touched my shoulder. At lunch, we sat together, the three of us, the air thick with unspoken history. My husband spoke animatedly about a project he and his brother were working on. I smiled when I should, laughed once or twice, but mostly, I focused on my plate. Across the table, our guest ate quietly, offering polite nods and the occasional question. He was distant, even more than usual. Not cold, just removed, like he was already somewhere else. Afterward, my husband decided to take a nap. He said the drive had worn him out. I helped him upstairs, tucked a blanket around his shoulders, kissed his forehead. He smiled at me, tired and content. I turned off the light and closed the door softly behind me. I found our guest in the backyard, standing at the edge of the garden, hands in his pockets. He looked like he was trying to memorize the landscape, as if he might forget it otherwise. I stood on the porch, watching him for a moment before walking down the steps. We didn't speak right away. The silence between us had grown familiar, almost protective. "I'll go tomorrow," he said eventually. I called the housing office. "They'll let me move in early." I nodded. "That's good." "It's not," he replied, glancing at me. "But it's necessary." I didn't argue. The wind picked up slightly, brushing the tops of the rosemary and lavender. He looked at them for a long time, then turned to me. "You deserve something more than this silence. This limbo." I felt my chest tighten. "I made this silence." He shook his head gently. "You didn't make it alone." We stood there a while longer, the distance between us not quite a boundary, but not an invitation either. That evening, the tension in the house grew thicker, like fog creeping in through the walls. I moved through the rooms slowly, aware of every creak, every shadow. My husband read in the living room. Our guest packed quietly in the guest room. I folded laundry in the bedroom, my hands moving automatically over towels and pillowcases. Dinner was quiet. We ate together again, but the atmosphere was strained. My husband seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply choosing not to notice. He talked about his plans for the weekend, mentioned repainting the shed. I nodded along, my thoughts miles away. When the dishes were done and the house began to settle, I retreated to the bedroom, claiming exhaustion. My husband kissed my cheek again and told me he'd join me soon. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, the weight of the day pressing into my spine. I didn't change into night clothes. I didn't get into bed. I stood there, staring at the reflection of myself in the window, watching the way the streetlights filtered through the glass. I looked like someone I didn't recognize. Or maybe someone I had forgotten. I heard a soft knock at the door. I turned, heart racing, but it wasn't what I expected. It was my husband. He stepped inside, stretching his arms as he walked toward the bed. "Tired," he said simply. I nodded, stepping aside. He climbed into bed, pulled the blanket up to his chest, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into the steady rhythm of sleep. I stood there for a long time, staring at him, at the man I had built a life with, at the life we had both let drift into routine and silence. I felt love for him, deep, enduring, but quiet. The kind of love that doesn't burn, but hums softly beneath the surface. And yet, it was no longer enough. I turned back to the window, watched the shadows shift on the lawn below, and realized something painful and true. I had made my decision days ago. Not with words. Not even with actions. But with every choice to stay silent. Every time I let the moment pass instead of ending it. Tomorrow, he would leave. And I would stay behind. In the house that once felt like home. Now filled with echoes I wasn't sure I'd ever silence again. The next morning unfolded with the deceptive stillness of routine. I moved through the kitchen like I had every day for years, setting the kettle on the stove, reaching for the same mugs, the same sugar jar, the same rhythm. But everything in me felt misaligned, like I was mimicking someone else's life with aching precision. The sky was heavy with clouds, but no rain had fallen. The garden outside looked dull, soaked from the night before. I noticed small puddles between the stepping stones and the leaves hanging low under the weight of moisture. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. It was the kind of day that makes you feel like something is about to happen, even if you don't know what. He was already in the kitchen when I came in, standing near the window, sipping coffee. I hadn't heard him come downstairs. He looked calm, as if sleep had cleared something from his face, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was dressed casually, his suitcase packed and leaning near the door. He turned to me when I entered, his eyes catching mine for just a moment. "I'll be leaving in a few hours," he said quietly. I nodded, but the motion felt disconnected from my body. I poured coffee into my mug, the sound of it louder than I expected. We didn't speak further. The silence between us had stopped being uncomfortable, it had grown into its own language. One of restraint. Of understanding. Of consequence. My husband entered the room a few minutes later, yawning and stretching, commenting on how early we were all up. He asked about breakfast and reached for the bread to make toast. No one mentioned the departure. Not yet. But I felt it in every move I made. After breakfast, I excused myself to go upstairs. I stood in the bedroom longer than necessary, looking at the bed, still unmade. My side was slightly wrinkled, his more orderly. I traced the edge of the comforter with my fingers, thinking about how many years I had spent smoothing this fabric. How many mornings I had pulled the sheets tight and hidden away every sign of restlessness. I sat at the edge of the bed, my hands in my lap, listening to the faint sounds below. Footsteps. Drawers opening. A suitcase being zipped. Then the doorbell rang. I didn't react right away. I waited, still and frozen, as though the world might return to its earlier silence if I held my breath long enough. But it didn't. It rang again. I stood, walked downstairs slowly, and opened the front door to find the neighbor holding a box. "I meant to bring this yesterday," she said cheerfully. "Some garden tools your husband asked to borrow." I thanked her, took the box, and watched as she peered over my shoulder into the house. "He's still here?" she asked, meaning our guest. I nodded. She smiled. "You'll miss the company, I bet." I didn't answer. She must have read something in my silence, because her smile faltered just slightly before she turned to go. Back inside, I set the box by the stairs and went into the living room. He was there, sitting with my husband, the suitcase beside him. They were talking quietly, something about traffic, the best time to leave, whether he'd need help carrying his things. I stood in the doorway, unseen for a few seconds. I watched the way my husband smiled, the way he clapped him gently on the back like a proud uncle. I watched the way he tried to hide the way his eyes drifted in my direction once he noticed me. And I watched the way he looked away just as quickly. I offered to make lunch before he left, and both of them accepted. It felt easier to fall into the motions again, to use the distraction of chopping and stirring and arranging plates to avoid the thoughts that pressed against my chest. The three of us ate together. My husband talked more than usual, stories from work, a brief complaint about a neighbor's new fence, an observation about the weather. I listened. Our guest listened. But I didn't believe either of us heard much. After the meal, my husband went to take a phone call, stepping outside for better reception. I stood at the sink, washing the dishes slowly, the water too hot, my fingers pink from the heat. He walked in quietly, set his glass on the counter. "I didn't mean for this to get so complicated," he said behind me. I didn't turn. It was never simple. I know. I rinsed the last plate, turned off the faucet, dried my hands slowly. "I'm glad I came," he said. even if I shouldn't be. Now I turned. He looked tired, not physically, but in that way people look when they've carried something too long. I'm glad you did too, I said. It was the truth. He picked up his bag. I followed him to the door, watching as he stepped outside, paused on the porch, then turned back. Take care of yourself, he said. I will. Then he left. No embrace. No lingering glance. No drama. Just the sound of gravel under tires as the car rolled down the driveway. I stood at the door long after he was gone, feeling the empty space expand like a vacuum in the hallway. The stillness returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was hollow. My husband returned inside shortly after, mentioning something about the call and the next project on his plate. He didn't ask about the goodbye. Maybe he didn't want to. Or maybe he thought there had been nothing to ask. That night, I changed the sheets in the guest room. I washed the towels, put them back in the cabinet, vacuumed the hallway where his suitcase had left faint wheel marks. Each motion felt deliberate, not as an erasure, but as a kind of closure. Later, lying in bed, I listened to the familiar rhythm of my husband's breathing. I watched the ceiling again, just like I had in all the nights leading up to this one. And I thought about what it means to stay. Not out of fear. Not out of comfort. But because leaving would mean giving a name to something I still didn't understand. The silence that followed his departure settled over the house like a film of dust, thin, barely visible, but unmistakably present. It was in the quiet click of doors closing, the unspoken pauses in conversation, the way I avoided the guest room even though it was just another part of the house now. The routine continued as it always had, but I felt as though I was moving through a space that no longer recognized me. Or perhaps I no longer recognized myself within it. The first morning without him, I woke to the sound of birdsong outside the window, shrill and bright. For a moment, I forgot he was gone. My eyes drifted toward the hallway, expecting to hear the familiar rhythm of his footsteps or the soft murmur of his voice. But there was nothing. Just the dull echo of the house stretching into itself. I lingered in bed longer than usual, one hand resting against the pillow, my mind retracing the past few days, not chronologically, but in flashes. The way he looked at me across the table. The sound of his voice in the car. The moment our hands brushed at the sink. I kept replaying it, not out of longing, but to make sense of it. To find the boundary between what was innocent and what was not. But that line had long since blurred. Downstairs, my husband was already dressed, preparing coffee and toast. He greeted me with the same quiet warmth he always did, asked if I had slept well. I answered yes, though the night had been restless, my body heavy with unspent words and unanswered questions. He didn't mention our guest. Not directly. He said only that the house felt quieter now. I agreed, and we left it at that. Later that day, I went into the guest room for the first time since he had left. It felt strange, like stepping into a photograph of a moment already past. The bed was made, though the lines of the sheets were too perfect, too deliberate. The window had been left slightly ajar, and a breeze had blown the curtain inward, leaving a soft scatter of dust on the sill. On the desk, I noticed a single sheet of paper tucked beneath a book. I hesitated before picking it up, unsure whether it had been left intentionally. The handwriting was familiar, even though it was brief. Thank you for seeing me. Not just looking, but really seeing. I won't forget it. There was no signature. No name. Just those words, and a silence that pressed into my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand. Not to hide it. Just to remove it from sight. I wasn't ready to throw it away. That evening, I made dinner as usual. My husband joined me at the table, and we talked about mundane things, the cost of groceries, the neighbor's new fence, whether the gutters needed cleaning before the rain returned. I responded with nods and half-smiles, my hands steady, my voice measured. But inside, I was unraveling. Not because I missed him. Not exactly. But because he had reminded me of a version of myself I had stopped paying attention to. The version that noticed things. That asked questions. That felt. That night, I stood in the garden longer than I should have. The air was cool, the sky cloudless. I stared up at the stars, trying to recall when I had last done that. When I had last stood still without thinking about the next task, the next obligation. I remembered something he had said about silence, that it wasn't just the absence of sound, but a space where truth could finally settle. I had dismissed it at the time. Now it felt like prophecy. The next few days passed in a fog of motion. I cleaned the guest room thoroughly. Washed the sheets. Scrubbed the baseboards. I rearranged the books he had stacked, placed them back on the shelf in alphabetical order. My husband noticed the effort. Making space for the next visitor, he asked with a chuckle. I smiled. Just tidying up. We didn't speak of him. It was as if a silent agreement had formed, not to ask, not to tell. My husband never questioned the tension that had hung in the air before the departure, nor did he press for an explanation after. He moved on with quiet acceptance. Or indifference. I couldn't tell which. One afternoon, as I was pruning the lavender, the neighbor called to me from across the fence. She asked how I was doing, whether the house felt too empty now. I replied that it was nice to have things quiet again, though I wasn't sure I meant it. She tilted her head and said, he had a calm energy about him. Not many young people do. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She lowered her voice slightly. He watched you like someone who doesn't just see the surface. I froze. My pruning shears hovered midair. He looked at you, she added, like you mattered. I cleared my throat. He's just thoughtful. That's all. She didn't press. Just offered a knowing smile and returned to her garden. That evening, I went through old photographs. Not looking for anything in particular. Just trying to reconnect with the timeline of my life. I found images from vacations, birthdays, quiet mornings. My husband and I looked happy in most of them, at least from the outside. I lingered on one in particular, us on the porch, coffee mugs in hand, the early sun catching his face. It reminded me that once, this house had been a place of beginnings. Now, it felt like a place that held everything I didn't say. Later that night, I set the table for dinner, lighting a single candle just for the ambience. My husband looked up and smiled. Something special? He asked. No, I said. Just trying something different. We ate in silence for a while. Then, out of nowhere, he said, you've been different lately. I paused. My fork inched across the plate. How do you mean? Quieter. Distant. He shrugged. But maybe that's not new. I looked at him then, really looked. And for a moment, I saw him not as the man I'd lived with for decades, but as someone standing across a widening gap, unsure of how we'd gotten so far apart. I'm just tired, I said. He nodded. He didn't ask tired of what. That night, as I undressed and folded my clothes neatly on the chair, I felt a pull in my chest that I couldn't define. A grief, maybe. Or a release. I slid into bed and turned toward the window, watching the shadows shift along the wall. I thought about the note again. Not the words, but the feeling behind them. Someone had seen me. And now I had to decide if I would continue to see myself. Days moved forward with the quiet efficiency of a clock. Each morning followed the one before with familiar repetition: coffee, chores, the soft murmur of the radio in the background. But inside me, nothing was repeating. Everything was shifting, slowly, like Earth rearranging itself beneath a seemingly still surface. I found myself waking earlier. Not from restlessness, but from a strange alertness, as though my body was preparing for something unnamed. I would lie there in the pre-dawn light, listening to the soft creaks of the house, trying to predict what might change next. On a Tuesday morning, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I found it. The note. It had slipped between the folds of a towel. At first, I didn't realize what it was, just a small piece of paper, creased, faintly marked. I unfolded it slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I recognized the handwriting. But it wasn't the one from the drawer in the guest room. This was different. Shorter. Unfinished. It read only, if he knew what I. The sentence ended there, as if he had been interrupted, or changed his mind. My heart pounded. The towel slipped from my hands. I looked around instinctively, as if someone might be watching, though I was alone. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closer. I folded the note again, more carefully this time, and tucked it into the pocket of my sweater. What had he been trying to say? And why had he not said it? I kept the note with me the entire day, pressing my fingers against the paper through the fabric whenever my thoughts wandered. I didn't read it again, but I didn't forget it either. It burned gently in the back of my mind, a flicker I couldn't extinguish. That afternoon, my husband asked if I wanted to take a walk together. It was rare, he rarely left his work early, but something in his tone suggested he felt the distance too. I agreed. We walked the path behind the house, the one that led to the old field lined with brittle trees and half-forgotten fences. It had been a long time since we'd walked there. The silence between us wasn't hostile, but it wasn't intimate either. It was observational, like two people measuring what was left between them. He kicked a stone along the dirt path. I watched the way his shoulders moved as he walked, the slight forward lean, the way his hands curled and uncurled in his coat pockets. After a while, he said, "Do you ever think we stopped talking about anything that matters?" The question came out of nowhere, or maybe it had been building for months. I looked at him, unsure how to answer. He continued. "I mean, really talking. Not about groceries. Or work. Or who's doing the laundry." I nodded. "I do think that." He stopped walking, turned to me. "Then why didn't we fix it?" I didn't have a simple answer. I thought about all the days we had filled with harmless conversation. All the nights we had gone to sleep side by side, never mentioning what we wanted, or feared, or missed. "I think we were tired," I said eventually. "And we thought silence was easier." He looked at the trees for a long moment. "Maybe that's worse than anything else. Choosing silence." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just stood beside him, watching the wind move through the tall grass. When we returned home, the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon. He went inside to answer emails, and I lingered by the mailbox, flipping through letters without really seeing them. One envelope stood out, a familiar logo, my name printed neatly on the front. I opened it absently, expecting a bill or a catalog. But it wasn't from a company. It was from him. My breath caught. There was no return address. No explanation. Just a short note, handwritten. It read. "I couldn't find the words before I left. I still can't. But I wanted you to know, being seen by you meant more than I expected. You reminded me that attention is a kind of love. And you gave it freely." There was no signature. But I didn't need one. I folded the letter slowly, my hands shaking slightly. I placed it back in the envelope, tucked it into the inside of my coat, and stood there for a long time, the sky darkening around me. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, my husband came into the kitchen and leaned against the doorway. "You were quiet on the walk," he said. I turned to him, wiping my hands on a towel. "So were you." He smiled faintly. "Yeah." We stood in silence, the kind that held a question between us. Then he said, "Is there something I should know?" The air shifted. My heart thudded once, heavy and loud. I didn't speak right away. He didn't press. Just waited. After a long pause, I shook my head slowly. "Not anymore." He studied my face for a moment, then nodded, as if he understood what I wasn't saying. We ate dinner together. Talked about the neighbor's new fence again. The weather. A package that hadn't arrived. The usual. But something in the space between us had altered. It wasn't mended. It wasn't healed. But it was no longer hidden. That night, I sat in bed long after he had fallen asleep. The letter rested in the drawer beside me. I hadn't read it again, but I could feel its presence. I thought about how easily things slip into silence. How quickly something becomes a secret. How heavy even the smallest truth can feel when held too long. And I wondered if maybe, in some quiet way, he knew already. Not everything. But enough. Enough to let the silence mean something different now. Not absence. Not denial. But a space where something new might grow. Or end. Or simply be. The morning began with the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the road, the kind of sound that usually blended into the background but now felt almost intrusive. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the half-empty coffee pot, the same ceramic mug in my hand that I had used every morning for years. The silence around me felt different, not thick or oppressive like before, but thinned out, as if something essential had been drained from the space. The letter was still in the drawer beside my bed. I hadn't opened it again, but I didn't need to. I remembered every word. I carried them with me, tucked into the corners of my thoughts like loose threads that refused to be tied off. My husband came in while I was slicing fruit. He moved quietly, politely, his presence more familiar than comforting. He asked how I slept, commented on the weather, offered to help trim the hedge later in the afternoon. I nodded and smiled, saying little. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't require rewriting everything we'd both chosen to leave unspoken. After breakfast, he left to run errands, hardware store, post office, maybe a stop by his brother's. He said he might be out most of the day, and I told him that was fine. It was. I needed the house to myself, just for a few hours. When the door closed behind him, I sat down at the table and stared at my hands. They were older than I remembered. The skin thinner, the lines deeper. I traced one of the veins with my fingertip, thinking about how time changes things gradually, quietly, until one day you no longer recognize what was once familiar. I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of the guest room again. The bed was perfectly made, the books stacked, the floor clean. But the room no longer felt like part of the house. It felt preserved, like a memory sealed in glass. I didn't step inside. I simply closed the door and walked away. In the bedroom, I opened the drawer and took out the letter. This time, I didn't read it. I folded it more tightly, slid it into an envelope, and tucked it into the back of a drawer under a stack of old receipts. Not to forget it. Not to bury it. But to give it a place. A boundary. A quiet corner in a life that needed space to breathe again. I spent the afternoon cleaning, not in haste, not to erase anything, but with calm purpose. I dusted shelves, reorganized the pantry, swept the corners of the kitchen where cobwebs had begun to form. Every action felt like a kind of reconciliation with myself. A way of returning to the present without denying what had come before. Later, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the wind shift the branches overhead. The rosemary in the garden swayed gently, its stems taller than they had been weeks ago. I thought about the way things grow, even when you're not looking, even when you're not ready. The neighbor waved from her yard, and I lifted my hand in return. She didn't cross over. Maybe she sensed that today was not a day for conversation. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the lawn, my husband returned. He looked tired, but not unhappy. He carried a small bag of groceries and a newspaper under his arm. We put things away together without words. It was a practiced rhythm. Comfortable. Predictable. After dinner, we sat on the couch. He read. I didn't. I stared out the window, watching the last light of day slip behind the trees. Then, unexpectedly, he set down the paper. I've been thinking, he said, his voice measured. Maybe we need some time. Apart. I turned slowly to look at him. His eyes didn't carry anger. Just resignation. Or maybe acceptance. What kind of time? I asked. He hesitated. I don't know. A few weeks. Maybe longer. Just to reassess. I nodded. Not because I agreed. Not because I disagreed. But because something inside me had already made that decision days ago. I could stay with my brother for a while, he added. Give you space. I looked at him for a long moment. And then I said, maybe that's a good idea. He didn't respond right away. Just nodded, stood, and walked upstairs. I remained on the couch, feeling something loosen in my chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't sadness. It was the quiet shift that comes when the inevitable finally arrives, not with a crash, but with a murmur. He packed lightly. Just a small suitcase and a few shirts. I stood at the door as he left, and we exchanged no promises, no accusations, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a look. One that said, we were here. We tried. After the car disappeared down the street, I stood on the porch until the breeze turned cold. Then I went inside. I walked through the rooms slowly, each step echoing differently now. The silence was not emptiness. It was possibility. A page unwritten. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea. I set it on the table, took a seat, and allowed the quiet to settle over me, not as punishment, but as clarity. I didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the not knowing. And that, I realized, was the beginning of something I could finally call my own.